Welcome back. This is our second video, and part one is why do we process? As we demonstrated in the first video, the images that we're going to work here have been decided upon because of their visual properties. Any one that we look at, we can see we have, this is a style that I am quite well associated with, is to have this foreground interest and then natural depth leading to some other point of interest in the back. So there's already depth in this. There's perspective and noticeable depth. We know that this is in front of this because of the scale. That mountain is obviously an awful lot further away than that rock. Cameras don't see the world like this. Cameras see the world as flat, two-dimensional objects. So we have to imply depth in our landscape images. It's the most important factor of landscape photography. If we look at the second image, again, we have a natural leading line through the frame that connects a foreground area through a zigzag, which creates tension, to another distinctive peak in the background. There's a lot of templating going on with these. In here, we do have, zigzags and lines and diagonals and so forth. The depth is less obvious. That could be implied as a little flat, and we're going to have to work a little bit harder with this image to make sure that we can show depth properly. But the point I'm making is that all of these images have, in my opinion, quite good compositions in that the depth is there in the image. We don't have to work too hard to imply the depth. Most of these were taken with a wide-angled lens, so that helps. Now, cameras don't see the world like we see them, and that implies, as I've said already, depth and perspective, and secondly, exposure. The way the camera looks at this world is it's going to flatten things a little because it can't deal with these extremes. When the human eye flicks through this frame, that can be understandably quite a bit brighter because it's snow. We know that snow is white, so therefore we could make that brighter and our interpretation of it will be quite natural. The next distinction we have to make is the difference between global and local adjustments. Global adjustments set the overall mood and feel of the image. As we demonstrated in this example earlier on, we had a situation where we basically said, right, is this going to be a warm image or is it going to be a cool image with warmer highlights? That is a mood decision. Is it going to be dark and mysterious or is it going to be bright and airy? These are global adjustments. Every time we move one of these sliders in the global area, we're making a global adjustment. It happens in every image that we do. This is a bright image. Not because it was a particularly bright day, because it wasn't. It's just because we haven't made our overall mood adjustment yet. As you can see, when we drag down our exposure, we create contrast, we create depth. And all of these global adjustments are basically making the overall feel of the image. And we can suddenly go from what we imported into Lightroom into how we're going to work the image, and we're looking at something that's completely different. Once we move on to local adjustments, that is when we start to accentuate the natural depth, the natural flow, balance, exaggerating or diminishing the importance of certain subjects within the frame. These are all the things that we will go on to demonstrate shortly. Now, let's move on to part two and have a quick overview of the tools that we're going to use, and then in the third video we can move forward with lots and lots of case studies and demonstrating all of these different tips and tricks that you need to make your images as expressive as possible. Welcome to part two, local tools. Now, I'm not going to recap all the global tools because we've already done that in Essential Lightroom, so I'm just going to concentrate just now on three things. One is the gradient tool, the second is the radial filter, and the third is the adjustment brush. So these are the only three things I'm going to cover in this part of the video before we move on to case studies. One of the most common comments I get from whenever I teach anybody about processing is how simple it is. And I think this is one of the great mysteries of contemporary landscape photography is people assume that all processing is complicated and requires an awful lot of skill and learning. Now, it's the same as anything, that you get out what you put in, and the more time you practice doing these things, the more intuitive it becomes. I'm quite certain that what I'm about to demonstrate to you will appear extremely obvious once it's been done, but the skill is having the foresight to see what an image requires. And this is the thing that I want to cover very much in the case studies, and I will touch on it now. So this is the image that we looked at a little bit earlier. It's had the import punch preset on it, so it has made some global adjustments. Let us look at this image and decide what we want to do. At the moment we have this beautiful foreground boulder with its lichens, a leading line that takes us to the snowy peak, and then an area of brighter sky because the sun was setting off to the right here behind the mountains. We want to create a stronger connection between those three things: this boulder, that mountain, and that rock. That patch of sky. The human eye will naturally go through the frame from the areas of size and highest contrast and brightness and identifiable subjects. So it's looking for bright areas, it's looking for contrasty areas, and it's looking for recognizable shapes. Recognizable shape, big boulder. Recognizable shape, big mountain. Area of potential brightness, the sunset. So these are the three things that we want to exaggerate. So let's look at the graduated filter first, or the gradient filter. This is basically replicating grads. Now, a grad was actually used in the production of this image. It was like a 3-stop soft, but it was really high up in the frame, so it was maybe a stop and a half, something like that. If I hold the shift key and drag down, whatever effect is on the brush will be applied instantly. If I double click on the word effect, it gets rid of all the adjustments. If you hold down the shift key, it makes this horizon line level. Otherwise, you're dragging at an angle, and it makes for, sometimes that's necessary, sometimes it's not. In this case, the horizon is relatively flat. The longer this line, the more graduated the filter becomes. The area above this line is 100%. The area below this line is 0%. And in between is the gradient. The longer the distance between the top line and the bottom line. So a short line means you're going to end up with a very dramatic graduation. The longer it is, the more graduated it becomes. So these are quite common filters. Now, I'm less likely to use it in this scenario for exposure, because we have stuff going on in here that we don't want to over darken, because if I darken the sky a little, it is also darkening these rocks, the hillside here. So you have to, if you're going to do that, you can open up your shadows a little bit, and that does compensate a little. But if you're going to go with significant exposure adjustments, then a graduated filter is not the thing to do if you have things that are going to get over darkened. But what you can do is use it significantly for color. So we can open up that highlight, which is going to brighten this area and probably brighten the snow a touch. And also we can add contrast, we can add saturation, and we can adjust the color. So moving it to the blue means we have a very blue, moody left side, and the right side has gone quite lavender. If we move this to the right, the overall sky gets quite warm, and probably it's good for the right hand side, but it's bad for the left hand side. So I'm actually going to put it a little cool, because I want color contrast. I want blues on this side, blues down here, and then I want warmer areas coming to the filter as well. So for now, that's okay for that first sky adjustment. However, I want to make a second adjustment. So let's zero the brush, click the shift key, and drag up from the bottom of the frame, because I want to add clarity. So clarity is going to affect particularly the stones and a little bit of these lines. And the second thing I also want to do is make it just a fraction bluer overall. And we'll push the saturation just a fraction as well. We're really going to work on this to make it pop. So these, you can see, because the graduated filter is affecting the entire bottom of the frame here, or with this top one it was affecting the entire top of the frame. It's basically a global adjustment, but not over the whole frame, if that makes any sense. Once we move on to the radial filter, that is most commonly used for creating vignettes. So if you drag an ellipse across here and darken, so that's inverted. If you click invert, the area inside the ellipse will be affected by the filter. If it's not inverted, then it's the outside is affected. So if I darken that, and the feather affects the graduation between the two. So the bigger the feather, the more it will come into the middle of the frame. The less, obviously, you get to a stage where you can actually see the ring. So I usually go with about 70-75%. That seems to work for me. And the amount of darkening is as much as you want. I think once you get to a point where it's too obvious, you've probably gone too far. I don't really want these corners to be significant in the frame, but we have to watch these top corners a little. There's no way to really deal with this so easily in Lightroom. Photoshop's a little bit easier for dealing with gradients because we can use masks. But I just wanted to darken that corner a touch. And again, if you feel you've gone too far, you can just open up your shadows a fraction. And we can deal with some of these areas later on with the adjustment brush. Now, what I said earlier was that not all processing has to be complex. We can use very rudimentary tools to make quite subtle adjustments. With the inverted mask highlighted, if I draw a little circle here and use a big feather, I can increase the exposure just of that boulder, boost the saturation, boost the clarity even a bit more. And if I just turn off and on the two radial filters that I've used already, we can already see how much we've changed the emphasis of that foreground, where that is quite flat in terms of the difference between the boulder and the water, and that is quite dramatic, is that the boulder really stands out. Now let's do the same thing up here with a new radial filter, and we'll just draw another ellipse, and with it inverted, let's just brighten that fraction and let's warm it. So this is the area that we wanted a little bit warmer. Boost the saturation a fraction. Even playing around with clarity and contrast will make some changes in there. And what we've done is we've used 3 radial filters to completely change the distribution of tones within this image, from something that is tonally quite flat to something that is much more tonally contrasty. And because we've warmed that area of cloud, we have created a real transition between cool to warm, running from the bottom corner of the frame up to the top of the frame. And that diagonal there is extremely powerful. With processing, you want to choose the most appropriate tool. So far on this image, we have used a couple of graduated filters and 3 radial filters to make some quite significant adjustments. Whether they are the most appropriate tools to make these adjustments are questionable. Certainly the vignette, you would always use the radial filter. However, to make adjustments to skies and boulders and things like that, the adjustment brush would normally be a more appropriate tool. So let's just delete these 2 for now. And you can see we're back to where we were before. And let's look at the adjustment brush. Now, the thing that most people fail to grasp so easily is the brush settings itself. Most people understand the adjustments that can be made, but it's actually setting the brush that can cause some confusion. With the size is quite explanatory. If you have a scroll wheel on your mouse, you can increase and decrease the brush quite intuitively. The inner ring is 100%. The outer ring is the extent of the feather. So the bigger the feather, the more feathering there's going to be, if that makes any sense. And then with zero feather, it's just 100% inside the ring and there's no feather whatsoever. If I quickly set a 4-stop alteration and drag that across my image, that's 4 stops brighter. That is obviously ridiculous, but you can see that's just added 4 stops straight away to the image, which is something we would never want to do. At any time, you can either click Effect to zero the brush, or you can click the individual filter, the individual parameter that you want to zero again. So size, filter. Flow and density are the two that people tend to struggle with the most. If I go back to that 4-stop brightening and I have the flow at 1% and I drag the brush across there, it is very gradually adding light to the image. So if I press the O key, you can see that's turning on and off the mask. It is making an adjustment, but even at 4 stops, it's bringing it on very, very gently. Of course, if I increase the flow to 50% and put the effect across, it creates the effect almost instantaneously and causes a great big ugly problem. So the lower the flow, you would never really use 4 stops. Typically, you're going to be making adjustments of plus or minus 1 stop. I mean, that's fairly normal. So let's say I want to look at this rock in the foreground. I am going to want to brighten it. So let's start with half a stop and flow at 50%. I'm going to feather it also about 75% with a smallish brush. And I'm going to come in there, and that's the whole rock being brightened. Now, the beauty of using the adjustment brush is that if I feel that's too bright, I can dial it back. So that's now a 1/4 of a stop. I can then add clarity, which is going to add texture and detail to those lichens. I can boost the saturation to bring it out even further. And I can change the overall temperature and tint of it. So if I feel it needs to be warmer slightly, and most of these adjustments are going to be quite gradual, quite gentle, but you can obviously make very dramatic changes. But the best thing to do with these things is to be bold, but to take it gradually. So I'm going to warm that rock slightly, and I'm going to keep the tint about where it is. So if I turn on that filter, if I turn off the filter, you can see what we've done. We've made that rock more prominent in the foreground. It stands out more. And if it stands out more, that is visual contrast. It's more stimulating to the eye. If I do the same thing with this sky and zero the brush again, and we want a big feather, and size-wise, I'm happy with that. Let's say we want to warm this area. We're not wanting to adjust the exposure, we're just wanting to change the color, and this is the beauty of these brushes. All I've done is I've increased the warmth of this brush by 25%. Now I'm brushing it on and you can see the effect. I mean, I'm doing this quite heavy-handed so you can basically see what I'm doing, because if it's gentle you're not going to see it. If I feel I've gone too far, I can just dial back a little further until I've got +10 adjustment, and if I turn it on and off, it's gentle but it's significant. I've created a warmth in here that wasn't there before. If I did want to brighten it a fraction, I can do so. So again, another gentle adjustment. And the point with these adjustments is that you're leading the eye through the frame exactly where you want it to go. So I want to enhance this line in the foreground. So I'm going to use a new adjustment, click the new button. I'm going to zero the effect of everything, and I'm just going to add a 0.21 of a stop. I'm just going to paint that across that facet there a little bit in those areas of water, a fraction in here, and I'm just drawing round, basically I'm just drawing round those highlights. And by shaping that water, just by brightening those little edges, and if I turn it on and off, brighten the highlights or darken the shadows, you're creating more contrast. We're leading the eye through this frame from the brightness of this foreground rock through this leading line, which we've made a little bit brighter and a little bit more significant, and through to this peak. Finally, with this peak, with a small brush, we're going to reduce the feather because it's quite a significant shape. We just want to add a fraction of brightening to that snow. Again, just 0.2 of a stop with very low flow. And if we turn it on and off, and now by popping that snow at the back, we've made a logical end point for our leading line. The rock through the leading line in the foreground to the snowy peak at the back, which we've made stand out against the darker sky. And then we've got this nice warmer light on the right hand side, which is conducive and consistent with the light that would have been shining on the scene. And we've found ourselves with just a very couple of minutes, a very couple of simple adjustments. We've made a dramatic visual difference to this image, and we're going to be using all three of these tools, the graduated filter, the radial filter, and the adjustment brush, extensively throughout all the case studies that come at the end of this series of videos, to demonstrate to you the importance of using them and the different effects that can be used by using them and combinations of them. So for now, that's the end of video 2, and we will see you in video 3.